started doing some checking into conferences. And we put together, we did a whole bunch of digging. And one of the things we found is that there's an InfoSec conference going on for almost every day of the year. Okay, and the numbers are just going up. It starts to look a little ridiculous when you look at it, because if you compare the number of talks that were happening in the early 2000s to the number of talks that are happening now, we're clearly spending a lot more time talking about security, and the question is whether our posture is actually getting better. So on the one hand, I was flinging criticism saying there's too many conferences. On the other hand, I'm one of the guys organizing a conference in South Africa called ZACon. Okay, so the natural question is, well, are you for conferences or are you against them? And the answer is yes. Okay, and what I mean by that is I'm for research, and I'm for growing research at a ground roots level. And so the big question becomes, well, what's good research? Okay, and it's not an easy question to answer. So if we take a look at stuff we've done in the past few years, really quickly, I gave a talk at 44Con last year, which is a nice InfoSec conference in London, basically titled Penetration Testing Considered Harmful. And partly because I've been a pen tester for just about the last decade, it caused about half the security guys on the internet to call me a complete dumbass, and at least some of the other half to say there's some stuff in there that makes sense. And then we put out a plugin that allows you to do GPG encryption in Chrome. And in 2011, for the first time, I skipped on going to a Black Hat. I haven't missed a Black Hat Vegas in years. But sitting at home, it made me wonder, when people tweet about Black Hat, whether they're tweeting more about the talks or whether they're tweeting more about the parties. And instinctively, I thought it was the parties, so we collected a whole bunch of tweets and ran some analysis. And it turns out I was wrong. Actually, people do talk more about the talks on Twitter than they do about parties. But at least now we have empirical evidence for that. And then a little while after that, we put out a tool, or we put out research on a tool that basically allows you to shoulder surf automatically. So basically using some of the cool libraries, using OCV, computer vision libraries, we can look at an iPad or look at a tablet and see which keys are being pressed because of the fact that the keyboard lights up. And basically, you put together an app that automatically shoulder surfs. I already mentioned to you the Conference Collector app, where our not-so-humble aim is to categorize, list, go into detail on every security conference since forever. Early before that, we put out an app on the App Store that basically takes a photo of you every time your screensaver is disabled. In part, I was just playing to see how the App Store worked. In truth, what it meant is there's a whole bunch of pictures of random people on the internet that probably shouldn't be there. And in 2010, what I wanted to do was see if we were getting better with memory corruption bugs or not. And what it had us do is go through all of the bugs that are currently saved in OSVDB, literally every one of the like 80,000 bugs, and see if we can get better classifications on them. And okay, so I'll dive straight in. So he starts his talk and he essentially says, the first thing you have to do is categorize what you mean by great research. And he says he's not talking about ordinary run-of-the-mill research. What he's talking about is Nobel Prize work. And he says it may not be Nobel Prize work in your field, but he says you can tell what's significant work and what isn't. And he says, well, how did he come to do this study? Okay, and you're talking about one of the most, in the end, recognized mathematicians in his field. And he says, well, he worked on the Manhattan Project. He was one of those guys putting together the bomb. And he says, while he was doing the Manhattan Project, he came to realize that he was just a stooge, okay? Because here he was working on the computers for Feynman and Fermi and Oppenheimer. He says he looked around and he was envious, okay? Because he saw that these were great minds and they were doing great stuff. And he became interested in what differentiates those guys from the other guys, and in fact, what differentiates those guys from him. And you see in part why I think his talk is so awesome, because 2 paragraphs in, we've already got coolness. Anyone know what that means? I don't either, I can't even read it. Essentially, it's the unexamined life is not worth living. Okay, and what you're looking at here is him saying, introspecting and saying, well, what differentiates those guys from him? And if you look at it in InfoSec, we've got just as many chances to look around and be envious, okay? For almost every walk of life that you could come from, there's someone under similar conditions that has stood up and done awesome stuff. You still a student, how could you ever be as elite as Jeremiah? Halvar was doing elite stuff as a student. You're sitting in some hell and gone part of the world, you find guys like Samuel who've done awesomeness. You find guys doing awesomeness from Poland. You're unemployed. Moxie did lots of his awesome stuff when he was unemployed. It couldn't have been lucky that he kept doing these great things. Okay, and he goes on to say, you see it again and again. If someone's great, they keep doing great things. Okay, and you'll notice the same in the InfoSec field. If you take someone like Dino Daizovi, you'll notice that across the years, he's touched lots of different areas. OS 10 shellcode, Wi-Fi, almost everywhere he scratches, he finds coolness. And you see it from guys like H.D. Moore. You see it from a bunch of people. You see it from guys like Dan Kaminsky, who's repeatedly put out something interesting. And if you look back, you'll find more and more things in his past where he's done interesting stuff. So for those of you who've ever used SSH and used the proxy mode, like if you were on a hotel Wi-Fi, for example, Dan's the guy who actually committed that code to SSH. Okay, and so again, you see more and more that guys keep doing good things. And so it kind of comes back to Pasteur's fortune favors the prepared mind thing. And what Hamming says is that the prepared mind sooner or later finds the coolness and does it. Okay, so it is luck. It's luck. Exactly which thing you find coolness with, but that you find the coolness isn't luck. And so instead of talking about what isn't the key characteristic, the question becomes, well, what is the key characteristic? And what he says is independent thoughts and the courage to pursue them. Okay, he goes into this question, and of course the logical question at this point is, what about having a lot of brains? Okay, surely you need a lot of brains. And he says, look, everyone in this room, and I guess the same goes for here, has a lot of brains. That's necessary, but not sufficient. Okay, it's got to be more than that. And he cites two examples of guys who he worked with, who looked kind of ordinary and run-of-the-mill, until they got their first breakthroughs, okay? And once they got those first breakthroughs, they kind of got the courage to go out and do more cool stuff, okay? And he talks about it and says, once you get your courage up and believe that you can do great things, you generally go out and do these great things. And in InfoSec, you kind of see the same thing happening. So if you've ever gone and read any of the stuff put out by the Corlan team, okay, what you'll notice is at some point, the Corlan guys actually took Samuel's exploitation class, or that's what it looks like. So at some point, they were literally writing a beginner's, here's how you do a Stack Overflow on some arbitrary Winamp type program. Okay, and from there, the guys just went on. So from that initial tutorial, they started putting out more and more goodness. And today, they write really nice plugins for debuggers to help you do your exploitation nicely. In a similar note, if you've ever looked at stuff put out by Johnny Long, Johnny Long popped up like at DEF CON in 2004. And he did, man, it was like initially, most of the guys looked at it and kind of went meh. He did this talk on Google hacking, like finding stuff with Google. And a whole bunch of people went like, that's nice, like you know how to use Google. But with that little bit of confidence, Johnny went on to do more and more interesting stuff. And I'm not sure how many of you follow it, but today Johnny is living in Uganda where he runs hacker missions. And he's basically doing like real tangible good in the world. And all of this started with him getting his confidence up. Okay, so he got his confidence up and the rest of the world was probably better for it. And then you bump into the ugly question for most of us who are starting to gray a little, which is how important is age? Okay, and he mentions, because it's quite a common misconception, he says, well, Einstein did lots of the things when he was disgustingly young. Okay, and there's a kind of a misconception that says if you haven't done your great work by a certain age, you're never going to do it. And you'll see in InfoSec, we kind of have the same thing. So at Black Hat Vegas, they give the Pony Awards. And for the Lifetime Achievement Award, you see that, I think it was Dave Vitale who said that, like models, hackers wear a lot of black, they think they're more famous than they are, and their careers effectively end at age 30. Okay, and so the question is whether this is true, whether you have to be young to do cool stuff. Okay, but again, Hamming comes back and says, look, in some fields, it seems that you actually get better as you get older. And so for InfoSec, we don't have a definitive answer, except you can look at the timeline or a line of people who are actually doing cool stuff. And on one end of it, you have GeoHot, who at 19 was taking down PlayStation's custom encryption or custom protection, messing with the iPhone bootloader. And way at the top, you had Robert Morris, who was still rocking at 78. And for almost every age in between, you have people doing coolness. So it's probably pretty clear to see that age doesn't become a limiting factor. But what is an interesting limiting factor is that when you're young, you're seldom clouded by success. Okay, and Hamming goes on to talk about this, where he says that success seems to have killed more scientists than anything else. Because once you become famous and once you do something great, it's hard to go back and work on the little acorns that then give rise to great oaks. Okay, and you see this happening consistently in InfoSec, where someone does a good piece of work and then disappears. And what Hamming says is effectively early recognition seems to sterilize you. And it's interesting for us in InfoSec, because for those of you who've ever looked at Moxie Marlinspike stuff, like Moxie went back and found out that you could get a certificate for any domain in the world using the null byte, okay? Like literally add a null byte to your certificate request and you can get the cert for paypal.com. Okay, what's interesting is almost everyone who starts pen testing or starts infosecing starts going into what? The null byte at like 2001, okay? It's an old attack, it's a trivial attack. It just needed someone to look at it with a beginner's mind, and they would have found that coolness. At some point recently, Comex, the guy who's now working for Apple, but the famous iPhone hacksaw, did an Ask Me Anything on Reddit, which is basically like a question and answer session. And what's interesting is, at some point, someone asked him, like, how did you do this stuff? And he says, well, you know, I enjoyed hacking, originally SQL injection and crap, and then he moved on. Okay, and what's interesting is, literally, Comex started playing around, started doing the sorts of attacks that people laugh at, and grew up and became Comex, okay? And it's interesting for the old guys in InfoSec who look down on the script kiddies, on the XSSs, on the SQL injectors, because literally the next guy you're laughing at could grow up to be the next Comex. Okay, so the thing you could take away from that is, okay, so you need a lot of time. Okay, you need to be a student like GeoHot and Comex, playing around with SQL injection. And even here, Hamming comes back and he says, in terms of working conditions, it's probably not what you think it is. Okay, he says that what most people think are ideal working conditions are not. Okay, and what he's talking about is the adage that says that genius needs constraints. And he gives examples of times in his life where actually the guys with the most resources don't solve the problem because they had too many resources. And it's the guys working with the constraints that do. And what he says, though, is the thing that you clearly need is drive. Okay, and he points out that almost all great scientists have tremendous amounts of drive. So he quotes Newton that says that if others thought as long and as hard as he did, they'd get similar results. And of course, this brings up an interesting paradox, because if you ever look at famous InfoSec rock stars, you're not seeing the I work long hours and slave through the night. Mostly what you're seeing is guys partying at conferences. Okay, and you kind of get this image a lot. But it's safe to say that this stuff is almost completely false, okay? for almost every speaker who you see speaking at a conference and talking about living the party life and partying at 3, I can guarantee you that these guys spent many, many months of not going out drinking so that they could work on their talk, okay? There's tremendous amounts of research that actually get hidden, and so most people think that it's kind of chilled. I asked people for quotes on this, and the Gruck actually went the other way. He says that drinking this much takes effort, and you can't just start out like that, so that's going to take work. But essentially, Malcolm Gladwell was talking about this when he put out his Outliers book. Okay, when he said that you basically need 10,000 hours of practice to be Bill Gates, or 10,000 hours of practice to become the Beatles. And in a way, Hamming touched on this all this time ago when he started talking about someone he worked with called John Tukey. Okay, I don't know how to pronounce his surname, but at some point, he found out that this guy working with him, John Tukey, was super elite, and then he realized that John Tukey was actually younger than he was. And so he goes to his boss and says, this is impossible. Nobody this young can be this brilliant. Like, he just knows too much for someone his age. And his boss, Carl Bode, essentially told him, you'd be surprised how much you'd know if you worked as hard as Tukey did. Okay, and what his boss was essentially pointing out was that knowledge and productivity are like compound interest. Okay, and he goes on to say that essentially the more you know, the more you learn. The more you learn, the more you can do. The more you can do, the more opportunities you get. And he goes on to say that given two people of approximately the same ability, if one person works just 10% more than the other, over time, he'll more than twice outproduce the former. Okay, and essentially what he's saying there is hard work pays compound benefits. Okay, he goes on to say something that's interesting where he talks about his personal relationship, and he says, look, this type of dedication takes a toll. He says if he's honest, there were times he had to be unfair to his wife. He says because that's what hard work takes. Okay, and you kind of see the same thing happening again and again in InfoSec. So Dino Daizovi tweeted at some point, and he said, if you found a bug, chances are someone else also has, and chances are that person is actually Taviso. Okay, I'm not sure how many of you know Taviso, Tavis from Google, but Tavis has done a whole bunch of awesome stuff. If there's a platform out there, at some point you are vulnerable to a bug that Tavis has put out. The early iPhone jailbreak came through his bugs. PSP jailbreaks came from his bugs. He breaks everything he looks at, right? Now what's interesting is, if you look at Taviso, at some point he tweeted something like this, which says, this crack me was really hard work, but it was fun. And he links to this crack me that he was doing. Okay, and what's interesting is, I pulled up this crack me. And if you look at it, let's just see if I can make it bigger. If you look at this crack me, you'll see something interesting here, where he essentially goes through, any of you know what crack me's are? Okay, so crack me's are a site that's dedicated to people who put up cracks and then other people who go in and then work on those cracks. It gives you a chance to work on your reversing skills. And Taviso goes through this crack me, and if you look at it, he talks about weeks and weeks that he's put into this crack me. Okay, and this is something that he did in his spare time. Okay, and even this documentation is completely unnecessary, right? But this is something that he's put in months and months of effort. And essentially, at the end, for him, it's just fun. It's just the stuff that he did to get lead. And what's interesting is, I spoke at BrewCon a little while back, and while I was waiting to give my talk, I was looking at this guy in the crowd. I'm not sure if you can tell, but this dude is watching an episode of How I Met Your Mother. Okay? So he's come to a security conference, he's sitting in the crowd, and he's watching a video. Okay, and at this point, like, I think the option is pretty straightforward. You have to decide which of those two guys you are. You're either Taviso or you I watch movies at conference guy. Okay, and both those things have natural parts and natural ends. Okay, and even if you look at guys like GeoHot and Comex, and you think like, those guys are really disgustingly young to be doing such cool stuff. But then you've got to ask yourself, what were you doing at 19, okay? Like, how many 19-year-olds are spending their nights looking at iPhone internals, first going to the next party? Okay, if you want to pull off that coolness, that's the stuff that it takes. So I guess the question is it a little bit hard? Okay, and Hamming says, no, or he touches on the genius is 99% perspiration and 1% inspiration. But actually, somebody spoke about this better than Hamming, which is the guys from Cracked magazine. Okay, on the one hand, that photograph is slightly disturbing, but other than that, the guys wrote this article about how the movie Karate Kid has ruined all of us forever. And what he talks about is, he says that in movies like The Karate Kid or Rocky, we've kind of grown up with this new thing that says, guy doesn't have the skills, there's a music montage, and the guy has the skills. Okay, and so we've kind of gotten used to this thing that says, you go from don't know the stuff, music montage, and it's okay, you know the stuff. And he says it kind of gets you to the point where you forget how hard the stuff is. And what he says is, he says it's like diets. It's not just that it's hard, because you know that a diet's going to be hard when you start it. He says, but it's so much harder, it's almost not fair. He says, like, you can run for half an hour, eat a muffin, and that's your half an hour's run just gone. So it's not just a little bit hard, it's a lot hard. Okay, and in part, we've kind of started growing to not like stuff that's this hard. And what Hamming talks about is, he says that great problems need emotional commitment. He says the great scientists are really, really committed to producing first-class work. And what he cites is, or one of the things that he touches on, is he says that almost everyone who studies creativity comes out and tells you that creativity comes out of your subconscious. And he's not the only one who said this, right? Like fairly recently, John Cleese gave a talk at the World Creativity Forum. And he gave his talk on creativity. And essentially what his whole talk is about is on how you get out of the way of your subconscious. And Paul Graham says almost the same thing. Like, he's wrote an essay called The Top Idea in Your Mind. And in Paul Graham's essay, he essentially says that in your mind, there's only a few things that you think about in the shower in the morning. And what you want to make sure is that the problem you really want to solve is the stuff that's occupying that top spot. Okay, and in Paul Graham's essay, he was basically saying, if you're running a startup, you want to be thinking about the problems you're solving, not thinking about raising money. Because one of those two things are going to be the top idea in your mind. You need to make sure that it's that you're working on the right problem. And so the question that you've got to ask is, didn't this guy ever rest? Like, it seems like all Hamming ever did was try to learn. And what's interesting is, even when he rested, he seemed to optimize for learning. Okay, and so in his essay, or in his speech, he talks about how he ended up having lunch with the chemists. And essentially what he says is, he used to go sit with the mathematicians, and the great mathematicians got their prizes and left Bell Labs. And then he used to sit with the physicists, and the great ones left. And so he says he went and he had lunch with the chemists. And after sitting with them for a little while, he asked the guys, like, look, what are the top problems in your field? Okay, and guys listed some. And after a little while, he asked the guys, well, look, what problems are you guys working on? Okay, and what's interesting is you see the disconnect between guys knowing what the big problems are and what the guys are actually actively working on. Okay, and what he says is there's a whole bunch of scientists who spend almost all their time working on problems that you know at the start are not the important problems in your field. Okay, and in InfoSec, I think this stuff applies to us like really, really seriously. You can spend a lot of your time hacking at the weeds and not getting to the fundamental stuff that's going to move the ball forward. Okay, we kind of spend our time by definition on stuff that's not going to be great work. We'll find the next bug in the next product, but it's not going to amount to anything significant. Okay, and again, Paul Graham talks about this when he talks about good and bad procrastination. And what he says is, he says, what's the best thing you could be working on? And the question that follows is, why aren't you working on that best thing that you could be working on? And he says something interesting which kind of kicks you in the gut. He says that sometimes you shy away from it because it's just too much of a challenge. Instead of tackling those big, hairy, audacious goals, as Tim O'Reilly calls it, you go for the small hits. Okay, and it's something that affects almost everyone. In truth, I've stopped doing as many conference talks because I kind of get the feeling that as conference speakers, we do some of the same thing. You do a talk, you get a dopamine hit, and then you move on. And you kind of get used to these small hits of dopamine, and it kind of stops you from working on truly cool stuff. So what Hamming did, what he prescribed for himself, was something that he called great thoughts time. Okay, and it sounds grandiose, but essentially what he did was on Friday afternoons, he carved aside time just to think about what he called great thoughts. So he'd sit there and say, how's computing going to change life at Bell Labs? Or like for us, it would be, what happens when internet communication is completely ubiquitous? Or what happens when everyone's got a smartphone and everyone's checking in all the time? Okay, but it allows you to see a little further. And what's interesting is, I mentioned Tim O'Reilly, and Tim O'Reilly gives this talk, like he gave this talk at Web 2.0 last year, where he basically said, the world's got huge problems, okay? Like we've got massive unemployment, we've got global warming, and the best and the brightest are working on like iFart applications for the iPhone, or how to sell advertising to people for Google. Like, it's a question of whether we're working on the stuff that matters. And he often quotes this poem by Rainer Maria Rilke, which is a beautiful poem, and the poet basically says, like, when we pick small targets, even when we win, the victories make us small, okay? And essentially, it's a call to arms to work on greater problems. And so Hamming goes on to talk about the importance of being prepared, okay? And he basically says that if you've got these great scientists, they sit around and they know these problems that are worth chasing. And they kind of wait for that break where they think, okay, here's an angle in. And then they dive into it. Okay, and he quotes what he calls a horror story, okay, where the guys at Berkeley basically pointed out that they had crunched they had the data to do the bomb before everyone else, but just hadn't gotten around to crunching that data yet. And it's interesting because he talks about the number of times that you have great scientists who just haven't chased down an angle, just because they kind of haven't gotten around to it. And the interesting thing to note is how many times that happens to you in InfoSec. You'll sit around and you'll see something get published and think, man, you had that idea 3 years ago. You just hadn't actually chased it all the way through. Okay, and I guess it's one of the key characteristics that he's talking about. When you see something that's worth chasing, you jump on it. And one of the natural comebacks when you talk about all this grandiose, doing great stuff things, is someone who comes back and says, man, that's all well and good, but I've got to get paid. And in my job, I've got to do a lot of little things. I can't spend all my time chasing these great thoughts. And even on that, Hamming gives you a solution. And he basically talks about a time when he had to do work for a government grant and some military contractor or some military official comes to him and basically gives him long division to do. Okay, so it's work that's insulting for someone of his stature, but it's where the grant money comes from, and so he has to do it. And what he says is, he goes back to, it ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it. Because what he talks about is the way that he went back and solved that problem. He ends up solving it more elegantly, and he actually says that through that exercise, he came out with Hamming's, with a new method of solving differential equations. Okay, so he went back, looked at the problem, decided to solve it more elegantly, and essentially changed mathematics. And if you look historically, like back in 2000, if you ever ran an exploit, you were really running hit and miss stuff. Like you'd literally go to hack.co.za, You'd pull some exploit, you'd hope it compiled, you'd hope it ran, okay, and the shell code was iffy. And then H.D. Moore started Metasploit, okay, and he did what everyone else was doing, joining together shell code and attack vectors, payloads, but he did it so much classier, okay, and everyone in the exploit world is so much richer for it. And Hamming literally says, you should do your work in a fashion that others can stand on your shoulders, okay? And again, if you take the Metasploit example, Metasploit isn't just a tool to attack things. Like these days, Metasploit is an exploit developer's workshop, okay? And literally it's because he's put together all of these pieces so that other people can build on it. And then he says, look, he's going to talk about something that's kind of ugly, and in an ideal world, you really shouldn't have to do this. But what he's talking about is actually marketing and selling yourself. And again, if we go back to Dino Dazovi, at some point he says, look, he learned years ago, if you want people to care about your research, you have to do marketing. Okay, so it doesn't matter how cool you are, if you're just cool to yourself in a room, at some point, you've got to do marketing. And Hamming agrees because he says it's not just sufficient for you to do a job, you actually have to sell it. Okay, so really quickly, he summarizes, he says, you've got to work on important problems, you've got to deny that it's all luck, okay, and then you have to make sure that you're not just thinking about small problems. And he takes a small diversion and says, look, for all of this stuff, like for all of how hard this work is the effort really worth it? Okay, and he comes back and he says, it's absolutely worth it. Okay, and in his paper he actually says that doing really first-class work and knowing you've done first-class work is as good as wine, woman, and song all put together. Because the truth is that the value in the struggle is worth even more than the result. Okay, like doing great work is intrinsically valuable. Okay, and so then he says, well, hold on, if doing great work is so rewarding, why do so many talented people fail at it? Okay, if these are the things that we say you do to do great work, why do so many people not make it? And so he says, well, look, the one thing we touched on was drive and commitment, okay? And he goes back into this and he says that the people who do great work with less ability, okay, they basically do it just by being more committed, okay? And essentially he says that even if you have an inferior intellect, just being more committed will help you push over the line. And this came up during his Q&A session also, where someone basically asked him to go into this matter of drive and commitment again. And he essentially says, look, let's be honest. You can go home and play with the kids and have a nice life, and essentially, you'll have a nice life, okay? But if you want to do great stuff, you've got to be committed to it. Okay, and again, this is where he talks about being unfair to family. And he says, like, you're fooling yourself if you think that you can do it without some of that. Great work takes commitment. You've got to know that that's the cost, and you've got to be prepared to pay it. And then he says that the second problem is one of personality defects. Okay, and he goes into a bunch of them. He talks about not delegating. And then one of those that he talks on that's interesting is that of ego assertion. And this one is interesting for me because, again, he talks about his colleague John Tukey. And what he says about Tukey is that Tukey almost always underdressed for situations. Okay, and so he cites the example. He says John Tukey would go into someone's office, and because he was under the office, it would take a while before the person realized that he was talking to what he calls a first-class fellow. Okay, and so what he says is, he says that over his career lifespan, Tukey spent a lot of time having to convince people that he was worth talking to when he could have just dressed the part also. Okay, and he says you don't have to conform, he says, but what he's saying is that the appearance of conforming goes a long way. Okay, and it's interesting, it's one of those parts of the speech or paper that really make me think, because I always thought that underdressing was a sign of not having an ego, so wearing t-shirt and jeans shows that you don't have your head stuck up your own rear end. But actually, if you think about it, it's almost completely the opposite. It's me saying, I don't have to dress up because I'm cool. Okay, and yeah, it's one of those things that I guess we have to fix. And then, almost presciently, Hamming says, many a second-rate fellow gets caught up in some little twitting of the system. Okay, and I don't think that Hamming was talking about twitting as in Twitter here, but it kind of gives you an interesting segue. And what I'm talking about here is how these days with Twitter and Facebook, it's kind of common to see people spending a whole bunch of time talking about research and talking about InfoSec, but not actually doing research or working on any of the hard problems. And it's a bit of a crazy generalization because there are some people who tweet a lot and still get awesome stuff done. But having said that, I've also seen enough people say things like, I've got a paper due, so I'm going to be putting my head down and I won't be on Twitter for the next 2 weeks. Okay, and if you're one of the people who's ever said something like that at some point, then almost by definition, what you're saying is the rest of the time that you are on Twitter, you don't have your head down working on hard problems. Okay, so you can do what you want with that. But what's interesting is that we kind of convince ourselves that we're the exception to this rule, that we can spend our time talking about the stuff instead of doing the stuff. And mostly we convince ourselves because of self-delusion. Okay, and what Hamming says is, he goes into this to some length where he says that we give ourselves alibis for almost everything. Okay, you can very quickly give yourself an alibi, like I didn't do it because of this, I didn't do it because of that, my work doesn't allow me to, my boss doesn't give me the freedom. And Hamming says, man, don't kid yourself. He says, like, it's okay, lie to other people, but don't lie to yourself. Like at some point, you need to stand up and say, I'm not doing the coolness because I'm not committed enough to it. And it's cool, you don't have to be, but don't make up a fake excuse. Okay, and so what he says is, you need to know yourself, you need to know your weaknesses, you need to know your strengths, and sometimes he says that knowing your own weaknesses can end up turning it to a strength. So he says, for example, he knows that he has a huge ego. And so in part, what works for him is committing to something publicly. Because once he's committed to it publicly, his ego won't let him not do it. Okay, he's going to force himself to do it just because he knows ego is that important to him. Okay, so a quick summary. People don't win because they're not working on important problems. They're not becoming emotionally involved. They give themselves alibis, and they keep apportioning what other people do to luck. Okay, and after that, Hamming basically said, in like the most straightforward way, which is apparently the way he rolled, I told you how easy it is, I told you how to reform, go ahead and be great and do great stuff. And that's all that I have.
Are there any questions for Haroon?
Nothing?
It was a clear story, probably. Nobody? Please raise your hand if you got a question. I will come to you with a microphone. But I got to see a question over there.
Hi, this is GD from Taiwan.
Hi.
And I would like to know, you mentioned some people have a stable and good life, and other people want to make dirty of their hands so they can work on many things. Do you have a suggestion of how to balance your life and this work?
So the question is how to get work-life balance. And man, the honest answer is, I don't think that work-life balance, so my honest answer in general, that what Hamming said, okay, as the expert, basically saying, understand that it's not going to be balanced. Understand that it's not going to be balanced. That if you want to do great stuff, you've got to understand and commit to the fact that there's going to be a lack of balance. But I've been speaking to a few guys about this stuff, and one of the things they point out is that it's not balanced to outsiders. So it's not balanced to someone else who looks at Taviso and says, that he spent all his weekends for 3 months working on a crack me. But to Tavis, that's his happy place, right? Like, he's not doing it as a grind. He's doing it because that's how he chose to spend his time. And so for Tavis, I think if you tried to force him to take a holiday instead of working on that crack me, you'd actually be killing him, okay? So I think in truth, though, where the stuff does become problematic is where you have external commitments. So if you have a wife and if you have children, then the question really becomes how you balance that stuff. And the honest answer for that, like Hamming says, look, he's had to neglect his wife at times. But I think you see that happening just about everywhere. Ask any of the guys who run a startup how many times they've had to bail on dinner because servers were overloaded or because of some crisis. It's a trade-off, and I think it's one of those things that we've got to accept, that if you want to do cool stuff or if you want to get the results, you've got to put in those miles. Anyone else? Yep.
Yeah, hi, my name is Habib. My question is, how do you know how you have the enough skills actually to go for doing something, right? How do you know actually you are ready or not ready yet, or you have to work on your skills first and then get involved in something?
Okay, so the question is, how do you know when you have enough skills to do the great stuff? So you've got to tool up and do the basics. And I think what Hamming was saying, and in part what I was saying, is you've got to start doing stuff. And when you start doing stuff, maybe some of that stuff becomes great stuff. Okay, so you put the hours in. And like if you take the example that I was saying, Moxie was able to get any cert in the world with a /0 attack. Okay, so part of the thing is actually getting on the field, throwing your hat in the ring, and doing it. So one of the problems that I've started seeing a lot, and it's why we started the ZACon conference that I mentioned earlier, is that new entrants to the field of InfoSec see this really high bar. Like you see some guys like Stefan Esser, and they're doing great stuff consistently. And it becomes hard to start at the bottom, okay, because there's this whole mountain of stuff that needs doing. And I think in part it goes back to what Hamming was saying about doing something, and then that giving you the confidence to do more. And I think in part, there's always guys starting, right? If you take most of the guys who are doing the awesome iPhone hacking right now, they've not been working on those platforms long. Like GeoHot hasn't been alive that long. And these guys have just picked the stuff up, and they started hacking at it. So especially for what we do, I think there's a big push for just get in there and do stuff. Like, good things will come out of it. Yep.
Hi, my name is Fadil. I'm from Singapore. I just want to ask your fundamental topic, you and your research. Basically, my experience of doing this research, right, I have always come across problems when I try to promote my research or vote an article. So, like for example, hackingnight.org. Okay, I try to post articles about my research based on GPS hacking, or social engineering, or even what was that? I can't recall. Some of them I wrote it, and when they replied to me, they say, okay, this research has been done, this article has been posted. So that's my problem I'm facing. Do my research has to be how to be made known to the public? And if I wanted it to be made known. So these are the things that actually demotivates me to actually perform. See?
Yeah. So just to repeat, the question is, you start doing something like you put together an article on social engineering, and you try to get it published, and someone says, this stuff's already been done. Okay, and I think getting your stuff published in most fields is difficult. With the interwebs, it's kind of easy. Like you put it out there. My blog actually has 3 people who read it, and 2 of them are related to me. But the honest answer is, I think if you look at what I touched on there, Comex was doing SQL injection stuff. Okay, so you put in the hours, you do that stuff, and at some point your stuff gets good enough and it bubbles to the top. Okay, and you'll see often in InfoSec, there were guys who published stuff, and it went 4 or 5 years without everyone giving it the credit it was due. And sometimes you see it for whole classes of attack. So in 2001, I wrote a chapter on web application hacking for for the Hacking Exposed guys. And I almost didn't include cross-site scripting. Like literally, I thought this was the lamest thing ever. I included it under protest. I said like, this sucks, because at the time it was just cluttering up bug track, right? People were putting in XSS for PHP cart and stuff like that. And today, the type of attacks that you can put together with cross-site scripting are awesome. And I think for that, what you have to go for is some of what Hamming's saying, which is just courage and perseverance. You keep doing the stuff, you keep putting it out, and sooner or later, good stuff will happen. I think, so lastly, just to flog it, he talks about the journey being worth it. So the act of doing the research and the act of putting your doc together, the act of putting it all on paper, should be worth it in itself. And normally what happens is you'll find a group of people who think that stuff is awesome. And from there, you get to move on. But I think if you're consistently doing stuff that's always been done, then maybe like part of it should be finding some other guys who'll push you on to the next level also. Like the stuff should be hard for you. If it's not hard for you, if you're just documenting the stuff that other people have already done, then that's probably something you should work on too.
Thank you very much, Haroon.